Dan Ellsberg describes his remarkable new book, which is essential reading, as a chronicle of human madness. And the record that's reviewed easily lives up to the title and raises serious questions about whether the human species is in evolutionary error. An objective and informed observer might conclude that since World War II, the species has been dedicated to establishing the thesis that humans are simply a mistake. That actually should have occurred to everyone with eyes open on August 6, 1945, a day that I remember all too vividly, both the horrifying news and the casual reaction to it. Actually, it resonated when I read recently William Perry's comment that he's doubly terrified, both by the extreme and mounting dangers and by the lack of concern over the threat of terminal destruction. Those awful events of August 6th taught us that human intelligence in its glory had devised means of destruction that would surely soon escalate to the point where a mass suicide would be imminent, and that's indeed what has ensued. Those familiar with the record will be aware that it's a near miracle that we've survived this far, and such miracles cannot be expected to persist. It's all too easy to list flashpoints around the world that might right now, tomorrow, explode to terminal conflagration. And it's useful to remember that when the doomsday clock was first set back in 1947, it was 7 minutes to midnight, which seems like halcyon days today from our perspective. Well, in 1945, we did not yet know that the nuclear age, the onset of the nuclear age, coincided with the onset of a new geological epoch, the so-called Anthropocene, in which humans are laboring not only to destroy organized human life, but many other species too, because of the accompanying sixth extinction that proceeds along with the Anthropocene, proceeds on its lethal course. Well, there have been debates about the onset of the Anthropocene, but last year the World Geological Organization settled on the end of the beginning of the post-war era because of the sharp escalation in environmental destruction that has taken place since that time. And when the doomsday clock was moved to 2 minutes to midnight last January, the accompanying statement opened by, I'll quote, warning of the failure to respond effectively to the looming threats of nuclear war and climate change, making the world's security situation more dangerous than it was a year ago, and as dangerous as it has been since World War II, which I think is an understatement. Our prime concern here is on the first of these threats, the nuclear age, but it's hard to avoid mention of the utterly astonishing fact that the most powerful state in human history, with unparalleled advantages, is not only refusing to join the rest of the world in making at least some effort to deal with the imminent and quite devastating threat of global warming, but worse yet, is devoting its energies to accelerating the race to destruction, and all for the exalted purpose of stuffing a few more dollars into overstuffed pockets before we say goodbye to the hopes for survival. And also, it's hard to mention the no less astonishing fact that so little notice is taken of this amazing spectacle. It's hard to find, you can't find a historical precedent for it. And what it all tells us about our society and our culture. And again, that's doubly terrifying. But let's keep to the nuclear threat. There will be little disagreement here, I'm sure, on the compelling need to eliminate, to rid the earth of the scourge of nuclear weapons. And others today will surely discuss the many ways to approach this goal. But I'd therefore like to say a few words about a different topic, different though clearly related, one which I don't think receives the attention that it deserves. And we might approach the topic that I have in mind by formulating a simple question that's worth some reflection. What would happen if political leaders decided to obey the supreme law of the land, just our own laws? In particular, to obey the United Nations Charter, treaty made by the United States in the words of the Constitution, Article 6, and thus part of the supreme law of the land. That supreme law of the land obligates us to resort to peaceful means in the event of international disputes and to refrain from the threat, I stress threat, or use of force in international affairs. That's an obligation under the Constitution. And you might ask yourself when that legal obligation was last observed by the president or any other high officials. We might, know the answer to that, and we might also reflect on what that means. Well, adherence to the supreme law of the land in the past would have spared us many tragedies, as well as some very near super tragedies. One crucial case instantly comes to mind, should not be forgotten. Adherence to the supreme law of the land would have saved us from what Arthur Schlesinger rightly called the most dangerous moment in history. Schlesinger's term for the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The frightening story should be familiar. I won't review it, except to mention that Washington's, Kennedy's terrorist war against Cuba, which of course was a serious violation of the U.S. Constitution, was a significant factor in inducing Khrushchev to undertake the reckless act of placing missiles in Cuba, as scholarship now fully recognizes. Dan Ellsberg, who followed the events closely from a privileged position within the government at that time, he now concludes that the terrorist war was probably the prime factor in Khrushchev's decision. The facts about that are not as well known as they should be, but you should recall that Kennedy's official plan for the terrorist war was formulated in National Security Memorandum 181, September 1962, and I'll quote it. The plan was to engineer an internal revolt in October that would be followed by U.S. military intervention. That was a month before the missile crisis. And in fact, terror was being escalated at that point in preparation, and it was a very serious matter. The record reveals that quite clearly, and more than enough was surely known to Russia and China, Cuba and Russia. Well, in brief, respect for the U.S. Constitution would very likely have averted the most dangerous moment in history, and it was no small matter. Those of you familiar with it know that we escaped by a near miracle, and it's much too little understood. Well, legality aside, there are perhaps some other reasons that other questions that might be raised about a murderous and destructive terrorist war, or so one might assume, but mistakenly. There's a review of released government documents on the terrorist war by Harvard Latin America scholar Jorge Dominguez, and he writes that only once in these nearly 1,000 pages of documentation did a U.S. official raise something that resembled a faint moral objection to U.S. government-sponsored terrorism. A member of the National Security Council staff suggested that the terrorist raids are haphazard and kill innocents, which might mean a bad press in friendly countries. That's it. So perhaps it's not a good idea. That's it in 1,000 pages of documentation. The terrorist war is a prime, if not the prime, example of the fact that engendered the crisis. And incidentally, for those of you who've read the XCOM transcripts, the detailed transcripts of the deliberations about the crisis, it is literally not mentioned once. Just doesn't matter. It's our right to conduct terrorist wars which lead to virtual destruction, and there's no need to even think about it. Very few people even know about it. Well, respect for elementary moral values, as well as respect for law, would have spared the world, very likely would have spared the world, this close brush with terminal disaster. It's not the first time, it's not the last time, up till the moment. And the same guiding principles, that is, simply observing the law, offer promising ways to deal with the crises that led to, quote the doomsday clock announcement again, led to a world security situation as dangerous as it has been since World War II. That's the latest setting of the doomsday clock, as close as it's come to terminal disaster since 1953, when also 2 minutes to midnight, when the United States and later the Soviet Union exploded thermonuclear weapons. So let's take a look at the examples that are mentioned, the cases that are mentioned in the current doomsday clock statement. Well, the first one is North Korea. So has there been a diplomatic path in the case of the North Korea situation? Now, there is one possibility. It's been advanced by China for some years, support of Russia, intermittent support from North Korea. And that's a double freeze. North Korea would freeze its development of nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States, in response, would cease its military actions, threatening military actions on the borders. That includes menacing flights by nuclear-capable bombers, the most advanced U.S. bombers. And that's not a laughing matter in a country that was flattened by U.S. bombs, merciless U.S. bombing in easy memory. In fact, when there was nothing left to destroy because all the targets were done, the U.S. Air Force simply destroyed the dams. Exultant comments about it in the official documents, the Air Force Quarterly. This was, if anybody cares, a crime for which Nazi war criminals were hanged at Nuremberg. Well, a double freeze would have opened the way to further negotiations. They might have gone as far as what was achieved in 2005. That's worth bearing in mind what that was, because the press has been seriously distorting it. What happened in 2005 was that under international pressure, President Bush agreed to enter into the six-power negotiations, and there was substantial success. I'll quote, North Korea agreed, I'm now quoting the agreement, North Korea agreed to abandon all nuclear weapons and existing weapons programs and allow international inspections. So let me repeat that, because there are constant lies about it every time you open the newspaper. North Korea agreed to abandon all nuclear weapons and existing weapons programs and allow international inspections. In return, the United States was to provide a light water reactor for medical use, issue a non-aggression pledge, and join an agreement that the two sides, I'm quoting, would respect each other's sovereignty, exist peacefully together, and take steps to normalize relations. That was 2005. So what happened? Instantly, within days, the Bush administration tore the agreement to shreds. It renewed the threat of force. It froze North Korean funds in foreign banks, and it disbanded the consortium that was to provide North Korea with a light water reactor. Bruce Cummings, the leading Korea scholar, as you know, writes that the sanctions were specifically designed to destroy the September pledges and to head off the accommodation between Washington and Pyongyang. That's 2005. I won't review the common press coverage of this, but open the newspaper and you'll see it. It says exactly the opposite. The path could have been pursued for several years, and now, as we know, there are even better options. So a couple of weeks ago, on April 27th, North and South Korea signed a historic document, Panmunjom Declaration for Peace, Prosperity, Unification of the Korean Peninsula. And the words of the document are worth reading closely and carefully. In the declaration, I'm quoting it now, the two Koreas affirm the principle of determining the destiny of the Korean nation on their own accord. On their own accord. Those are very important words. They went on to call to completely cease all hostile acts against each other in every domain, to actively cooperate to establish a permanent and solid peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, to carry out disarmament in a phased manner in order to achieve the common goal of realizing through complete denuclearization a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula, to strengthen the positive momentum towards continuous advancement of inter-Korean relations, as well as the peace, prosperity, and unification of the Korean Peninsula. And they further agreed to actively seek the support and cooperation of the international community, which means the United States, for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And furthermore, as Korea specialist Chung In-moon reviews in a current issue of Foreign Affairs, Journal Foreign Affairs, the two Koreas did not just make high-level commitments, I'm quoting him, they also laid out specific timetables for implementing them and took concrete steps that will have immediate effects in facilitating cooperation and preventing conflict, which is, as he points out, something new and significant. There have been agreements before, but never with this specificity. And again, it's important to read the words of the declaration carefully. Their import is very clear. The United States should back off and allow the two Koreas to achieve peace, disarmament, unification, and complete denuclearization. We should accept the call for support and cooperation of with this endeavor on the part of the Korean nation, its two parts, to determine their destiny on their own accord. Crucial words of the declaration. So to put it more simply, the declaration is a polite letter saying, "Dear Mr. Trump, declare victory if you want to prance around in public, but please just go away and let us move towards peace, denuclearization, and disarmament. And the plea could hardly be more clear. It's very far from the interpretation here, and that's worth paying attention to as well. So the general reaction here was lucidly articulated by Mark Lander, foreign policy specialist in the New York Times. He explained that the declaration complicates Washington's strategy, quoting him. Mr. Trump will find it hard to threaten military action against a country that's extending an olive branch. That's true. It's pretty hard to threaten military action, which incidentally is a criminal act. Remember, the threat of force is a criminal act. And it's hard to do that when the target is extending an olive branch. So we really have some problems. It's very clear that peaceful means are available to mitigate one of the most serious of the threats that's bringing the world as close to terminal disaster as it's been since World War II, since the onset of the nuclear age. And citizen efforts can be significant, maybe even decisive, in realizing the prospects for peace in Northeast Asia that now are indeed before us, in realizing the efforts to ensure that Washington does not once again undermine the prospects for peace in Northeast Asia. And I stress once again, since it is not the first time. It's also worth noting that U.S. analysts have been very clear and quite frank about the real nature of the North Korean threat. So here's foreign affairs commentator Max Fisher in the New York Times. He writes that North Korea has achieved what no country has since China developed its own program a half-century ago, a nuclear deterrent against the United States. They've achieved that. And Trump's threats and sanctions, he says, have not succeeded to reverse or stall these gains. So clearly we must do something to prevent anyone from deterring our resort to force and violence. That's a fundamental principle of U.S. foreign policy. Well, let's turn to Iran, which poses a similar problem, similar to North Korea. Among specialists across the spectrum, political spectrum, you find very few who would disagree with the conclusion of the respected and properly conservative International Institute of Strategic Studies. This is 2010, when there was still some thought that maybe Iran is developing nuclear weapons. They concluded that Iran's nuclear program and the willingness to keep open the possibility of developing nuclear weapons is a central part of its deterrent strategy. U.S. intelligence concurs. They were reporting to Congress regularly that the Iranian threat is part of their deterrent strategy. And again, it's intolerable to the two rogue states that rampage in the region that anyone should have a deterrent. Well, there's much talk about Iran's possible violations of the JCPOA, the Joint Program, the Iran Deal, even though the International Atomic Energy Agency, concurrence of U.S. intelligence, has repeatedly given Iran a clean bill of health. There, however, is virtually no talk about the fact that the U.S. has been violating the agreement from the very beginning and is continuing to do so. So the U.S., if you read the agreement, it says the U.S. has, in fact, been repeatedly seeking to block Iran's reintegration into the global economy, particularly the global financial systems controlled right here in New York, and to undermine, I'm quoting the agreement, to undermine the normalization of trade and economic relations with Iran. All of that is in violation of the agreement, strict violation. It's ignored on the prevailing tacit assumption that the indispensable nation stands above the law. Well, Trump's decision a couple days ago to effectively withdraw from the agreement was not surprising. It was, of course, anticipated. And contrary to what's often said, Trump is actually highly predictable. He's constantly described as unpredictable, but that's simply untrue. In fact, you can predict with close precision exactly what he's going to do simply by recognizing the guiding principle, which is quite simple. The guiding principle is me, exclamation mark. And there's a corollary, namely, if anything was done by the black demon, maybe Antichrist, who preceded, then you do the opposite. Just think through the policy decisions of the last couple of years and predicts it with virtual precision. So and it just doesn't matter what the consequences are. It's kind of irrelevant, just like on destroying the climate. It's somebody else's business. And in this case, the consequences might be, we don't know, to induce Iranian hardliners to return to nuclear programs, which they had abandoned. That could provide an opening for John Bolton, Netanyahu, the rest of them, to realize their openly stated goals of direct aggression with consequences that range from awful to horrendous. Well, are there peaceful options? I mean, in this case, the question simply doesn't even arise. The U.S. could rejoin the world, could permit the JCPOA to function effectively as it's been doing, and perhaps the U.S. might even refrain from regular and constant violations of the agreement. All of that's a possibility. But actually, we can do a lot better than that. There's one point on which I agree with President Trump. He's constantly talking about ways to improve the agreement. And there are ways, very interesting ways. And the most obvious and constructive ones, for some odd reason, are never mentioned. So let me mention them. The agreement could be extended to moving towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. The spread of such zones around the world is valuable in itself for mitigating threats, but it also has symbolic significance of no slight importance in simply as an expression of the global determination to rid the world of these monstrous devices. And in the troubled Middle East region, it would be of particular importance. Just come back to that in a moment, but as an aside, we might bear in mind that in other regions, such positive steps to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons have been attempted, but they've been impeded by the refusal of one country to permit the zones to go into effect. So there's in Africa a nuclear weapons-free zone, but it can't go into effect. It's held back by Washington's development of nuclear facilities in Diego Garcia, which is regularly used for bombing Central Asia. It's particularly true under Obama, who rapidly extended it to include nuclear submarines and nuclear prepositioning. There's a Pacific nuclear free war zone, nuclear weapons-free zone. That can't go into effect because of U.S. insistence that U.S. military bases there accommodate nuclear weapons. So that's more work for us to do. Make it public, do something about it. Well, coming back to the Middle East, serious steps towards a nuclear weapons-free zone would undercut any imaginable threat that Iran is alleged to pose. And there's no need to obtain Iran's acquiescence. they've been vociferously calling for it for years, particularly as the spokesperson for the G77, the former non-aligned countries, which are strongly calling for this for years. What about the Arab states? Absolutely no problem. They're the ones who initiated the proposal, starting with Egypt about 20 years ago. So they're strongly in favor. There's overwhelming international support. So why doesn't it happen? Well, actually, the matter does come up every 5 years in the NPT review sessions, and there's one problem. The United States vetoes it. That's why it doesn't happen. Last one was Obama in 2015. And the reason is perfectly obvious to everyone. Don't even have to bother stating it. Israel's nuclear weapon systems must not be subject even to inspection, let alone steps towards dismantling. So there's various reasons given for this, but they're below even discussion. They're not even worth mentioning. We understand the reasons, and so matters stand. We cannot improve the JCPOA in the obvious manner. It's important to add to this that the United States, along with the United Kingdom, have a special responsibility to work to establish a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone. They're committed to this goal. These two countries specifically are committed to this goal by an important Security Council resolution, 687, Article 14, if you want to look it up. It commits those who initiated and voted for the resolution, U.S. and Britain, to move to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone. And that commitment takes on even greater force because it's this resolution to which the U.S. and Britain appealed when they were seeking desperately to find some shred of a legal pretext for invading Iraq. Well, it's another example that illustrates the value of observing the supreme law of the land, and even of referring to it. You might find it, see if you can find anyone even discussing these facts. Well, I won't go on, but case by case, if you run through the record, you'll find that serious investigation does reveal the wisdom of the principles of the Charter, and actually the principles of the founders who created the constitutional obligation to abide by valid treaties. Well, it could be argued, and indeed often is argued, that law, including international law, is a living instrument, and its substance changes depending on prevailing practice, which would, of course, include the practices of the global hegemonic power. And we need not tarry on the conclusions that would follow from this line of reasoning. But concerned citizens should not tolerate these conclusions. And it's unnecessary to stress that a great deal is at stake in reversing them, reaching as far as safeguarding the future of humanity. Thank you.
It strikes me, in terms of Professor Chomsky's original field of linguistics and his groundbreaking work, that human beings have an innate capacity for language, that we also have an innate capacity for love and for seeking truth. And I think that in his other field of political and social criticism, that Professor Chomsky bears that out as well. We do have a microphone. Great. I was going to ask if we did. All right, a few questions, and I would love, love, love to have gender balance, and with your permission, I'm going to try to make that happen.
I wonder if you could comment on a thought that I've had over the past week, and maybe a lot of people had, that North and South Korea are creating this unprecedented armistice with the backing of China and Russia. And I wondered whether that is looking towards a new axis of power, of world power, in which the United States would be less relevant than, and I'm being ironic here, than it thinks it would. A corollary question to that is, do you believe that people like the people in this room and people across the country are going to be able to halt a Bolton and Pompeo-led march and frog marching, maybe frog march is the wrong word because he's so eager for it, Trump, to the use of nuclear weapons?
First part was the possibility of a new axis, confluence of interest, let's say, between North and South Korea, China and Russia to counter U.S. power, especially U.S. threats to Korea. And the second one is in terms of, do we have the power as citizenry to stop Pompeo, Bolton et al. From catastrophe?
The second, I think, yes, of course. I mean, there's plenty of things we can do to reverse policy. With all the flaws of this country, it's still a remarkably free country by comparative standards. We have plenty of opportunities. About what might eventuate, you've got to speculate, but I think something that's not unlikely, if Trump's advisors have at least half a brain still functioning, they have a very simple policy that they can follow. Tell him to shut up. Just stay away. As I said, prance around in public, talk about what a great deal maker you are, how you've overcome what Obama failed to do. You made the great deal of the century, but just stay away, let them work it out, take credit for it. And then I think what's likely to eventuate is not a Korea, China, Russia agreement, but rather a development in Korea rather like Vietnam. In fact, I'll just tell you an anecdote. I went to North Vietnam in 1970, right in the middle of the bombing. There happened to be a brief bombing pause, and I was invited to come. They didn't tell me the reason, but it turned out the reason was they wanted me to lecture at the Polytechnic University, or rather the ruins of the university, during the brief bombing pause. So a couple of days I talked about everything I could think about. They run a very tight state, so you do what they tell you to do. The first morning that I was there with Doug Dowd and Dick Fernandez, who some of you know, the first morning we were taken to a war museum where we sat for 3 hours listening to an incredibly boring discussion about the wars that Vietnam had with China in the 12th century and so on and so forth. And what they were telling us is very simple, and anybody with a brain could have understood it. U.S. intelligence apparently didn't have a clue. They were telling us, look, you guys are bombing us, but you're going to go away. That guy up there is going to stay there. He's our problem. China's our problem, not you. You'll go away, we'll still have China looming. The war could have, this was so obvious, it took the inability to comprehend it is mind-boggling, but strength of ideology is such it couldn't be comprehended. And I think it's probably the same with Korea. We're going to go away, but China's still going to be there. And it's not unlikely that if the Trump people have any brains at all, minimal understanding of the world, they could pull off something which would be good for the world for once, and might end up with Korea being kind of like Vietnam, moving toward. You have to remember the power of the United States. It's overwhelming. There's a lot of talk about U.S. decline, and if you look at figures like what's usually discussed, GDP and so on and so forth, yes, looks like a decline. But if you look at the actual figures, it's not a decline. You take a look at the proportion of the U.S. economy, of the global economy, that's owned by U.S.-based multinationals. That's the real measure. It's about 50%. It's just nothing remotely comparable to this in human history. 50% of the global economy is owned by US-based multinationals. They're first or second in every category. The US runs the international financial system. Could be changed, but nobody's likely to change it. In military terms, the US is so far ahead of anyone else, you can't even talk about it. Nobody is going to fiddle, and the US is a very dangerous country. It's a violent, brutal country. Nobody wants to take any chances with it. So I suspect that, again, if the Trump people are thinking they could reach an outcome which I'd be happy to applaud, even knowing that it's totally cynical and vicious and so on. And that's a very possible outcome, I think.
Well, if I can just follow up, though, do you see the possibility that, at least in the short term, China might play a positive role in reaching an agreement as a guarantor of North Korea's security, at least in the short term?
Well, I think China has been playing that role. And they've been playing a pretty sensible role. In this case, there are other things that are doing which I think are totally unacceptable. But in this particular case, China has been, for years, calling for a diplomatic settlement and even proposing an obvious way to do it, perfectly obvious way. You start with a double freeze, move on to negotiations. Maybe you could get back to 2005, which was a very good agreement, not the only one, but a very good one. They couldn't have played a more constructive role. So yes, I suppose they'll continue to do it. They don't want U.S. troops on their border. They don't want U.S. troops in South Korea.
Or collapse of North Korea.
Or certainly not the collapse of the regime. And incidentally, everyone understands, including U.S. intelligence, that the North Korean regime, which is maybe the most disgusting regime in history, but whatever you think about it, they are trying to get to economic development. That's agreed on all sides. And they cannot do it as long as there's the crushing burden of an arms race. Actually, if you look at history, this is very similar to what was happening in Russia in the late 1950s. When Khrushchev came in, he understood that Russia was way behind the United States in every imaginable respect, military, economic, and anything else. And he wanted to reduce the military burden so that Russia could develop economically. And he actually offered the United States a sharp mutual reduction in offensive weapons. When Kennedy considered it, rejected it, and responded by the biggest increase in armaments in human history, that's one of the factors that led Khrushchev to put the missiles in Cuba, to try to right the military balance. The other was the terrorist war. We should think about those things. In each one of these cases, there were things that could have been done that would have averted, in this case, almost terminal war. And it remains true today. The similarity, Korea and Russia are different in many ways, but this similarity is a real one and worth thinking about. These things come up all the time. It's also worth remembering that if you look at the record of U.S. intelligence estimates, almost invariably, they've wildly overestimated enemy adversary capacities. It was true of ground forces in Europe, the bomber gap, the missile gap, the Iranian threat, case after case. Wild threat inflation. Probably believed. One of the interesting things about Dan's book, Dan Ellsberg's book, from when he was on the inside at RAND, basically part of the Air Force, is that he says they did believe fervently all of the totally false estimates. And it's quite interesting how the intelligence worked. That tells you something too. Turns out that Army intelligence was accurately estimating the Russian non-existent missile threat. Air Force intelligence was wildly overestimating it. RAND was part of the Air Force, so they did too. Now, what does that have to do with? Budgets. It has to do with U.S. budgets. The Air Force wants the big budget. The Army didn't want the budget for the Air Force. Those are the considerations on which the fate of the world rests, as long as we allow it.
Everyone, please thank Professor Chomsky again.